just started the recording, and we will end the recording right after Markus's talk so that the Q&A is not going to be recorded. I think all of us can agree that we are facing an ocean full of data. Today, marine scientists are receiving terabytes of data from the seafloor to the atmosphere, and this data originates from remote sensing activities connected in ship-based observatories, autonomous instruments, high-resolution models, HD video stream, omics data, and obviously much more. We at MARDATA think that in order to decipher and unlock the full potential of this data, we need a somehow new and particular data scientist. We need a marine data scientist. At MARDATA, our mission is actually to define, educate, and establish exactly that, the profile of marine data scientists by enabling early career scientists and researchers with a strong computer science background to apply their skills to the multidisciplinary marine science challenges. And we support those doctoral researchers through a comprehensive training program that covers marine science aspects, but also state-of-the-art innovative data science methodologies. MARDATA currently consists of 33 doctoral researchers organized in 2 cohorts. The first cohort started in 2019, and the second cohort has just recently started in 2021. In total, we have 54 plus supervisors and PIs involved in those projects, and the doctoral researchers come from 12 countries, pretty much all over the world. MARDATA is a cooperation between the 2 leading German marine science Helmholtz centers, AVI at Bremerhaven and GeoMar in Kiel. And the 2 Helmholtz centers have partnered with their respective partner universities in Bremen and Kiel, who will provide the data science expertise in the projects. Our doctoral researchers and the projects they're working on are organized in roughly about 5 themes. We have projects that look into engineering approaches to smart underwater data processing. We have projects that help to discover knowledge in marine data, software, and literature that predict marine sources using machine learning, using machine learning and numerics to improve marine models, their output, and analyze that. And last but not least, we have projects that look into bioinformatic approaches to improve the genomic analysis of marine genomics. If you want to stay up to date with what MARDATA is and what we're doing, please feel free to have a look at our website, www.mardata.de, or follow us on Twitter at DataMar. With that, I'd like to already now hand over to Victoria, who's going to give you an introduction into the Helmholtz Information Data Science Academy. Victoria, feel free to share your screen, please.
Thank you very much, Enno, and I'm happy to welcome you as well from the Helmholtz Information and Data Science Academy and just say a few words about us. So Helmholtz, as probably a lot of you know, is Germany's largest scientific organization with 18 research centers and 6 research areas. And inside Helmholtz, HIDA connects and serves as the roof of 6 data science research schools, and they are linked in a network of research centers and top-tier universities. And of course, MARDATA is one of them. And with that, HIDA is Germany's largest postgraduate training network in information and data science. So here you can see all the 6 data science research schools throughout Germany, the referring centers, and yeah, all these details you of course can find on our website as well. And I will send the link later on in the chat. The activities of HIDA are a lot of training and networking events. We have a course catalog on our website and also an events website where you can find all the things we are connecting within the Helmholtz Association. And of course, a huge part of our activities are also the exchange and visiting programs. As well, we have data science job offers, and the website for that I will also post later on. So with that said, if you're interested in HIDA activities, follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, subscribe to our newsletter, where you also can find the announcement to our events and so on. And I wish you a lot of fun today with our lecture.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Stefan, the floor is yours.
Having audio switched on, right? So, yeah, welcome. Markus Reichstein, he's the director of the Max Planck Institute for Biogeochemistry in Jena. He gave us a very inspiring keynote at our 6th Data Science Symposium in November last year, pointing us at AI as that trend in Earth system sciences. And Markus is also a member and co-applicant of the NFDI for Earth consortium, which creates a national infrastructure for research data. In NFDI for Earth, we will establish AI and data cube methods, for example, and services in piloting projects. And we will have a data science academy as well, going to start right now. So there are obviously many connections to MARDATA that make Markus' lecture a perfect contribution, I think. And I am pleased to welcome you, Markus.
Thank you. Yeah, let me share my screen. So thanks a lot for the invitation to this. Actually, I must say I also enjoyed very much the conference last year, in particular because it's interesting to see approaches in different disciplines. And marine science, although it's also earth science, is quite different in many respects regarding the challenges, but also regarding the methods, how observations are taken compared to the terrestrial sphere where I'm kind of working on. And you will get now more of a flavor on the terrestrial part, but as was already said, as Stefan already said, with respect, of course, machine learning methods, AI, and I think I'm looking forward actually to the discussion, and we can see how things can be transferred, what makes sense and what does not make sense in a broader context. I think what we are all interested altogether, what unifies us, is really the Earth system, which is a very challenging study object because it's a complex system where biological, chemical, and physical processes interact with each other to make up this complex system. So we need to understand all these different disciplines. So it's a very interdisciplinary research topic. And the other challenge is actually that it is a unique system. So it's a system where we cannot have 100 replicate Earth where we can do experiments on each of these replicates, as we can do with plants or with organs or with microbes and so on and so forth. And that is, of course, a big scientific challenge. So we have to learn actually about the Earth also to a large extent, just from observation, from natural experiments, and of course also from modeling experiments. And experiments are restricted to smaller scales like ecosystems or laboratory or mesocosms, which of course also useful. On the right-hand side, you see another aspect of this complexity that I guess you're all aware of. From molecule to globe, processes play an important role. And that actually spans 17 orders of magnitude in terms of space, indicating this spatial complexity. And one can make up similar things for temporal, for timescales from seconds to geological timescales, of course. I mean, this kind of idea of complex systems is not new. It has led, and it's of course in textbooks and so on, into this concept of different spheres in the Earth system, so subsystems within the Earth system that interact with each other: atmosphere, biosphere, the hydrosphere with a large part, of course, the oceans, and then the cryosphere, the frozen water. And we are now in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene, with also societal processes, economic processes play an important role. Now in the Earth system, one can see that from space that we are emitting light in the night, and so on and so forth. And basically, the thing is that the system is made up through the interactions of these subsystems by exchanging, for example, trace gases, which relate, of course, to greenhouse effect, for example, but also to ocean acidification. or also soil acidification, and on the other hand, exchange of energy between all the different spheres, in particular, of course, between the atmosphere and then the surface of land and of ocean, but also of the cryosphere. So this is already kind of a conceptual model, if you want a bit of a reductionistic model, and that has been certainly perfectionized in the 80s, 90s, I would say, and it is this reductionistic approach where the idea is basically, if we understand the different systems, here the physical climate system is indicated, and then the biogeochemical cycles, and this is also then differentiated between marine systems and terrestrial systems. If we understand all these subsystems and describe them with known equations that often are coming from small-scale experiments and so on, that then if you wire everything together, if you put everything together, that then we have a model of the Earth system, that's an Earth system model, which can then simulate the emergent basic behavior of the Earth system in terms of how the weather develops, how the climate changes, how the carbon cycle and other biogeochemical cycles develop over time. And this has been, of course, a very successful paradigm, which is currently leading partly to this digital twin Earth, and there's this nice publication from Peter Barrow from ECMWF with increasing computing power and putting in the respective equations here for atmospheric dynamics. One can basically simulate the atmospheric dynamics, the formation of clouds, in a way that the image is hard to distinguish actually from real satellite images. So this paradigm is certainly successful. On the other hand, and that is basically a bit where I'm coming from, and our community, the carbon cycle or the coupled climate carbon cycle interactions, is if we look into the future in this complex system, we see that there are really huge model uncertainties. So here's basically how much carbon dioxide is being taken up by the land from 1860 to 2100, modeled with an ensemble of models. And you probably know that of our emissions, let's say roughly 1/4 of the emissions are taken up by oceans currently, and another quarter roughly is taken up by terrestrial systems, so that actually a bit less than half of the our emissions actually remains in the atmosphere, which mitigates climate change and the greenhouse effect. And so this is quite well known, and you see also that most of the models actually simulate within some uncertainty that nowadays, yes, we have this kind of uptake of carbon dioxide by the land. But if you look into the future, you see that some models say this uptake will really strongly increase in the future, while other models say, oh, it can actually turn around, that the sign is actually changing, that which actually means that even more carbon dioxide is released from the ecosystem to the atmosphere, which would create an additional greenhouse effect, and if you want a positive feedback or a vicious cycle. So these models don't even agree at the end on the sign of this flux by the end of the century. This is, of course, scientifically quite discomforting in terms of system understanding. And here I'm citing the study from Pierre Reichstein 2014, but a little bit less than 10 years before, we had basically the same figure. And so there was really little real or little visible progress in terms of predictability being made in these 10 years, and it doesn't look much different now. And so that has really led some crisis in this Earth system model. So instead of despite making these models more and more complex and putting in more processes in, the uncertainties have been actually not reduced. And that actually had led us in 2017 or so led us to think about a bit more why is that and how can we improve the situation, and has basically led to this perspective, where we really argue that one of the problems is that the data, the largely available observational data that has been already mentioned in the introduction, also has not been really exploited to full extent, and that there's now a lot of data out there, and there are also a revolution of methods, machine learning, deep learning methods to exploit those data. But at the same time, I will come to that these methods and these data should also not be blindly applied or used, but should be combined with the process understanding that we already have. Yeah, so it basically starts really from this simple sketch. Actually, we made that actually more for machine learning people, that they understand that the Earth system is really a super interesting study object, also from a scientific perspective, because it's prototypical for all of the V's of big data: volume, velocity, variety, and veracity, and of course also value. And maybe actually what is kind of partly unique because of these different aspects of the Earth is really the variety, where we have point data on Earth, we have integrated data, we have satellite data that gives us regular information for all the globe in regular intervals, or we have these airplane campaigns where we get only regional information but still spatially distributed, and so on and so forth, and that across very many scales, of course, is a big challenge. This multi-scale variety of system data. And I want to give you just one example at the beginning, which is kind of foundational for our research, and actually shows how to some extent that a variety is not only a challenge or a problem, but can be actually used, or should be used, to get a holistic picture of what's going on in the Earth. So I start with these terrestrial observation stations, where the exchange between the ecosystems and the atmosphere of water vapor, so evapotranspiration, and carbon, which is net ecosystem exchange, are observed in a non-destructive way, in a kind of coordinated fashion in this FluxNet network. You see that the dots are not evenly distributed, but there are more than 500 of these observation stations, and these give actually half-hourly information, half-hourly fluxes between the ecosystems and the atmosphere. They can be depicted in these fingerprints. Because they are so characteristic for each ecosystem. There's nothing else than an isopleth diagram, where on the x-axis we have time of the day, sorry for the small fonts, and on the y-axis we have time of the year, and then the colors indicate how strong the quantity is that we are looking at. In this case, we are looking at the net ecosystem exchange. Dark means that ecosystems take up carbon by photosynthesis, and the dark green and the reddish colors mean there is release of carbon dioxide by respiration. And we see in a tropical rainforest, it is active all over the year. It's changing diurnally. In a European beech forest, around whatever, in Germany or in Denmark or so, we have a totally different picture. We have some relative inactivity in winter, and then a strong start of the activity, because then the leaves of the beeches sprout out. Then very large uptake fluxes that are as high as in the tropical forest, but then in autumn, pretty rapid stop when the leaves are falling down. So the growing season is shorter, and that's why a beech forest is not as productive as a tropical forest. But the maximum rates are actually similar, and it's similar for a Mediterranean forest, where only the maximum fluxes happen in spring, when it's already warm but still wet enough, and then in summer the systems suffer from drought, and you see then here the reductions of fluxes in July and August. So I show you that basically to show you that a lot of information in physiological information about how ecosystems respond to climate can be extracted from those just those observations. these are not experiments, these are just long-term observations. And now these observations, as I mentioned, are across all kind of ecosystems, even if it's not evenly distributed. Actually, the climate space is not so badly covered, but still it's only covering, I once calculated, less than 1 ppm of the Earth's surface. So one cannot really make an average and that get what's going on the Earth, but one has to be a bit more, a bit smarter, let's say. And the idea is basically that we should actually integrate the variety of the different data streams here to get then a global picture. And the idea is basically these individual stations only give us information about roughly one square kilometer, but we have information from half hourly to decadal timescales now. And that on the other hand, we have remote sensing. In this case, optical remote sensing, which gives us daily to weekly information on how the surface looks like. It doesn't give us really what we're interested in. The remote sensing just gives us the interaction with electromagnetic radiation, and not really the function like photosynthesis or evapotranspiration. So what one needs to do is one needs to join these two information, and basically they intersect at this kind of scale, two scales here. Basically bring these two information together, and this is basically just a regression model with any machine learning method, like a tree-based random forest kind of thing, or kernel-based neural network approach. And then one has built a model, one can then apply that model to these global grids of remote sensing data and also meteorological data to get then actually a global picture. That's actually a pretty simple idea, but it was kind of let's say 2010 or so. It was for the first time that one could think about it because of the data streams becoming available, and that basically gave us this first observation based, how we call it, breathing of the biosphere, breathing of the terrestrial biosphere, of course, only, where we can basically see here. So that's the photosynthetic uptake. Of course, is uptake in summer in the northern hemisphere, and inactivity in winter. But we see also here now coming up monsoonal dynamics in Southeast Asia that are more depending on water availability, and similarly how Africa here, for example, goes up and down, following by the ITCZ. Again, related to water availability. But of course, this is just an animation, and I don't know. Okay, and what we can see here, that was quite important to see that we can then actually also constrain these carbon cycle models. You see here in gray our estimate, our observation-driven estimate. You see some uncertainties, of course, that we also have. But you see actually the process models that are part of these climate models have had actually much larger range, and these results could actually already help to constrain, in particular in the tropics, some of the issues in the vegetation models. Has to do with radiative transfer and nitrogen cycle. I can't go into detail, but it was kind of a hint to the model developers developing the hypothesis what can be improved in the model. Maybe another very practical conclusion that we can actually again just draw from the data that I personally like is if we just look at the conversion efficiency of the radiation. So on the y-axis we have the chemical energy that is basically created by photosynthesis versus the radiation energy incoming radiation. And what we can see here that is overall conversion efficiency is much less than 1%, and can only reach its highest values where actually precipitation is also high. And under situations where it's drought limited, here the yellow points, then it's actually almost negligible, this efficiency. And just to compare that with photovoltaics, here's a 10% efficiency line, and we have already left of that line technologically, and photovoltaics also doesn't use water. That at least gives a hint to me that, and I think because it has been now realized that bioenergy, maybe 10 years ago it was a bit high, but the bioenergy is not going to solve our energy problem in the most efficient way. Okay, this was just a little bit on kind of data-driven prediction, kind of regression approach. The second example is really trying to exploit the multivariate observations that we in particular have from space, for example, for detecting anomalies in the Earth system, extreme situations. So we call these different data streams together data cubes because they are in space and time, and then we have multivariate view on that, as you can see here. I think it's also pretty simple concept. And the question is, of course, now how can we find constellations of these different variables in space and time where they are really, really strange, and going beyond some predefined thresholds that are typical, for example, in the World Meteorological Organization, like heat wave is day more than XYZ degrees Celsius and so on, but rather look at the constellation of the variables. And we just looked into these data cubes and try to understand globally where and when are these really abnormal. And here we just have a cutout of the situation, basically here with visualizing the year 2010 in space and time, and then basically the orange blobs are the situations where the scores of anomalies, multivariate anomalies, are high. So we identify a couple of them, but one particularly big one, which is as you can imagine, the Russian heat wave, which is of course was a big event and had a lot of important impact. I don't go into detail here. The main point is just that this is then detectable without having thought about it before, just from the data. And of course, the Russian heat wave is can be also detected just with one dimension of data, just the temperature. But we actually find more interesting things here. So we basically detect all kinds of events, and many of them that have been not recorded, really, particularly in Africa, for example. And so you see all these events here on the map that we have been recording, and red means that they had negative effects on vegetation activity, particular carbon uptake. Blue means actually positive effects. So some extreme events had actually also positive effects. And now the question is, can we understand when it's negative and when it's positive? Can we predict the impact of these hydrometeorological extremes? And that is not so easy. One can, for example, make a visual analytics approach where we just plot all the events against surface moisture or within a space of surface moisture and temperature. And it gives us a hint that at lower soil moisture, there seem to be more red points, and also at higher temperatures, but there are a lot of exceptions also. So it doesn't seem to be so easy to separate that. And that's again where a machine learning approach that can handle multivariate data, that can handle more difficult to grasp patterns more objectively comes into play. And in this case, we use an XGBoost and then the today already outdated or kind of outdated LIME approach to understand what kind of features are important and give in which direction also their importance is. And what we see is basically that vegetation plays a quite important role, with forests in general actually in the short term responding positively under those situations, while savannas and grasslands rather respond negatively. And then just as another example, the duration of the event here is another important feature, with the effect that the longer an extreme event is happening, so kind of the dose is bigger, then the more negative the effect is. So these were just two examples from past research. On the one hand, more regression-based, on the other hand, more unsupervised. And I would like now come to, in the second part, to deep learning. I'm sure that you are quite knowledgeable about it, so I will be pretty fast and maybe just make quickly the link to geoscience, because basically the limitations of all these approaches that we have been actually taking ourselves are very evident. For the approach that I showed for predicting photosynthesis, for example, globally, dynamic effects like effects of past climate and so on were actually only considered with some hand-designed features. Some of you may know some standardized precipitation index and these kind of indices that basically accumulate precipitation over the past month or years, or similar things are temperature sums. But these have been really like designed by hand, and maybe these were not the best ones. And secondly, spatial context was actually not considered, but each pixel is kind of treated first of all independently of each other. So interactions between pixels cannot be considered. And these are actually two effects: spatial context and temporal context, which are basically where deep learning is basically made for. In particular, but not only, of course, the initial convolutional approaches in deep learning, which read just quickly, where we basically see that there are so many analogies from the classical approaches to Earth system questions, like object classification directly maps to pattern classification of hurricanes or atmospheric rivers or drought situations. The challenge of super resolution reconstructing phases in this case is very similar to statistical downscaling and blending of climate model output, for example, or weather prediction. And then if we go more into the dynamic domain, a big topic in machine learning is video prediction. So predicting future frames in a video based on past frames. This directly links to short-term forecasting of either climate variables or meteorological variables like precipitation, or also a condition of vegetation or conditions of ocean chlorophyll and so on and so forth. And last but not least, there's like the sequence analysis, which is language translation, which very strongly links to dynamic time series modeling, because in language also the meaning of a word really depends a lot on what has been said 2 or 3 sentences before. So one has to memorize what has been happening before, and that is similar for example ecosystems, where the carbon balance of forest depends a lot on if it has been burned 10 years ago or not, or if it has been arable fields before or not, and so on and so forth. So that is, I think, pretty clear. I would like to give you just one example here, which we started with actually, and we found I found very exciting when we started with that, and it's basically using deep learning for spatial prediction of climate effects at landscape scale. There's actually a classical, let's say, conceptual model that if we know climate, human, and geo factors that are working on the landscape, one should be actually able to predict the landscape, what the landscape is doing, the vegetation, the soils, geomorphology, and so on and so forth. And but it's not so easy to model that really from first principles. I'm not aware that landscapes have been really predicted with physically based models. And so the idea is basically, can we actually get a predictive model with this deep learning approach? And I won't go into too much detail, but the main point is that we only have coarse resolution impact, for example, of climate. Mixed resolution, actually some are a little bit higher, like the land use. And then we use here convolutional generative approach, conditional generative adversarial network, pix to pix, for those people that know that. It's a paper from 2017, I think, from Isola. And to see if we can then basically generate how a landscape looks like from space. In this case, we use Sentinel-2 data. Yeah, and it actually worked out pretty well. So we have basically here on one row the simulated images and then the real images in the test data set. Of course, these are good examples, and it's, I guess it's very hard, and I don't remember to say what are the real ones and what are the generated ones. They shouldn't be exactly the same, but they look similar. So the lower ones are the observed, the upper one are the predicted. And you see that not only the overall color, the average conditions, but really also the spatial structure is represented, at least visually. And visually can be always also tricky. Of course, one should use some metrics, some quantitative metrics that Chris Rekina, that's from his PhD work, has, of course, done, and what we can actually see, like landscape metrics of these patches, like fractal dimensions or connectance, are actually always modeled with much better correlation to the real world than, for example, a fully connected network that cannot extract the spatial the spatial context and the spatial relations, or the same as also, or similar things are happening if we shuffle everything in space, or we permute in space, then also the spatial structure cannot be learned, and the predictions also much worse, or for all of those metrics. Of course, and that was an idea of Chris. One could do that also to make to imagine, let's say, how the landscape would look like under climate change. So one can just say, okay, this is the current situation, and now we just make a sensitivity analysis with this, changing mean temperature, changing annual precipitation, and what we get is actually at least quite plausible. But of course, it's a totally space for time substitution, and I think one should not really do that in a predictive way, but it may be an imaginative way, because this doesn't extract causal relationships, and also not space for time is always a bit dangerous, and it's also statistical extrapolation, of course, in a sense in time. So one should always avoid it. But the argument could be that if one does space for time, and ecologists, by the way, do that a lot, and geographers do that a lot, so then one can also maybe do it with more complex models if one is aware of the limitations, of course, that this one has. Of course, it's more okay. I need to speed up a bit. More or challenging, but also, of course, very interesting to understand if we can really model the temporal evolution of ecosystems in time. And a nice example is the 2018-19 drought, where basically this is from the ESA, where basically the ecosystems turned more or less from green to brown. That's also how they say it within a month. But if we actually look more locally, and this work by Anna Bastos and Henrik Hartmann at our institute, we see actually in this case it's carryover effects, but it doesn't matter. We see partly red, partly green spots, so it's not everywhere so uniformly negative. And if you look even with a drone, for example, we see that there are even patches of trees that die, that brown, and others do not. And understanding that is very challenging, and again hard to model with physical models. And again, the idea is here: can we understand that with machine learning approaches that take into account spatial context, like distance to groundwater, distance to rivers, landform, if it's convex or concave, if it's south-facing or north-facing slope, and then, of course, interacting also with the species that are there. So this is basically something, well, you're mostly ocean scientists, I guess, I don't know. We have set up a challenge to make these predictions. So you're invited to contribute to this challenge and see if one can actually do these predictions. Skip over that slide in the interest of time. So of course we have some architectures that start to work somehow to predict kind of the evolution of the landscape in such a cube here, high resolution cube. But yeah, I will skip that because I really want to come to the point, which is certainly very important, that all these approaches are a bit black box, because it is really just fitting. If you want a complex statistical model to the data, one can do explainable AI with them. I skipped also this kind of part, but still the knowledge that we have is actually not really incorporated, and this is of course unsatisfactory for us as scientists, but I think also in general throwing away knowledge is also something that machine learners don't like, because there's no free lunch kind of paradigm also. So I would like to come to this approach of hybrid modeling, or more generally, how can we bring together knowledge, existing knowledge, and machine learning. This is actually one core topic also of our Alice unit, which has just founded last December. And maybe this graph just shows you quickly that there are different ways of how knowledge can be integrated. Causal modeling also plays an important role. And then we have here a different applications where that can be very, very important and helpful. I'd like to show that the overall principle of how to bring data and models with this scheme, which basically at the beginning just shows a system model. So it's coming from a system model perspective, where a submodel generates some output, and the output is input to another submodel. It can actually feed back, and the whole model is of course also driven by some external forcing. Typical system model, like climate model or so. And we were thinking about and also in the interest of time, there's model evaluation. You can drive a model with a machine learning output. You can do the whole model evaluation with a more pattern-oriented approach using machine learning instead of just creating scatter plots, let's say. But the real challenging and interesting part where model development can be also directly improved, we believe, is what we call hybrid modeling, where submodels of a model can be that are actually theoretically not very well founded, can be replaced with a model that has been learned from data, so a machine learning based model, or similar if we have often parameterizations of models where the parameterization can be instead of done ad hoc or with some heuristics, can be get from data in an optimal way. From the machine learning perspective or deep learning perspective, one view would be basically that this deep learning, we have these different levels of abstraction from layer to layer in a neural network. Here, these simple features and more abstract features, and that at the end of that chain, we then predict physical model parameters. So these are by definition interpretable, that are fed into a physical model to give then physically meaningful output. Usually I would explain a bit on the right hand side, but let me also skip that. I have now one example that is coming from soil science, and a pretty simple, almost a toy example, although it's a pretty important example, and but it can show you some of the idea in a very simple way. It's basically modeling respiration out of the ecosystem, and the respiration is temperature dependent, as we all know from this biological rule. With 10-degree increase, we have a doubling of the biological activity or something like that. That's this Q10 value of 2. But it also depends on the base rate, so on the overall activity, how many roots are there, how many earthworms, how many fungi and microbes, and so on. And this is kind of the base activity that's much harder to model with a physical or thermodynamical approach because it's so messy. It's biological, and we can, if you just plot, for example, the respiration against temperature, we see that different systems have very different apparent temperature responses. Like a summer active system has a strong apparent temperature dependency, because in summer it's anyway more active, while a Mediterranean system seems to have a weaker temperature response. But again, it's confounded just by the water availability that's dry in summer. And so this is not the real temperature response, but just the apparent or the confounded one. So we were, back in 2010, we were trying to see if we can actually get the intrinsic temperature sensitivity. And what we did there is making some assumptions about the time scales where these different processes vary. We basically say, oh, the temperature relation will be always active. Also on the short time scales, why these biological overall variation will be more smoothly varying, so seasonally varying, as you can see here on the bottom. So we have basically two different scales that we address, and that we estimate the Q10 from the one scale, and then can infer the base respiration by solving the equation basically on the other time scale, and that actually worked quite well. We found actually that the Q10s are very similar across ecosystems across the globe, and all the rest that is sometimes published is really confounding factors. But we thought now that one could also use this hybrid modeling approach for getting this Q10 value, where basically the RB, the variation of the biological activity, is modeled with a neural network approach here in LSTM, depending on some input variables. and is then fed into this physical equation, where then the Q10 parameter also is to be estimated, and then everything is optimized together, the neural network weights on the one hand, and then the Q10 on the other hand, and optimized against the time series of respiration. And what we actually get here is a very similar seasonal variation now of these biological activity, as you can see here, but we get more variation in our hybrid approach. And this variation is not noise or so, but if we zoom in, actually we do see that there is additional variation detected or inferred, hypothesized by that system on the diurnal scale, and it varies also between months. So we have different months, and the diurnal variation of this inferred RB variation is very consistent and is also changing between the months at pretty plausible rates. It's not a proof that this is happening, but at least there's a chance that we get this inference also of this RB variation, not only the long time scales, but also on smaller time scales, which was not possible before because we had to hand design features and separate the different scales. Last example, if I may, is the same approach. Actually, it just came out yesterday, the last paper on that approach by Kraft and Hess, hydrological system science. Same approach, but larger scale and more complex, more data, where we had a hybrid global hydrological model with the idea, with the idea basically that we have a simple water balance model. I just give you just one example. For example, here we have the groundwater pool that is updated. The QB, the base flow, is subtracted from the groundwater from the last state. It's recharged here with a plus from flux from above, and recharged from another flux from above to update the groundwater. All the same is for the soil moisture, which is here cumulative water deficit, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of a physical, very simple conceptual hydrological model, which makes sure that the mass balance is kept. But we have a lot of coefficients, for example, how the precipitation input into the ecosystem, how it partitions between runoff, fast flow, recharge of the soil, and recharge of the groundwater. So all these alphas, for example, and these coefficients, for example, are learned with a neural network approach here, again an LSTM that is fed with methodological drivers, but also some static drivers where some features are extracted with dimensionality reduction methods. But the key point is that these are learned from machine learning and then fed into this physical conceptual model to give then a data informed but still physically consistent approach. And it's kind of it's learned against a couple of observable data streams like terrestrial water storage from grays, evapotranspiration, snow water equivalent, and then runoff information. But it can also infer some so-called latent variables like groundwater and soil moisture that are not observed. So basically, we have the deep learning architecture on top, and then the hydrological mass balance equation on the bottom, which are coupled. And it actually worked quite nice. Typical scatter plots. It's actually very similar to very complex models, like physical models that are around. We can, as I said, we can diagnose these different water cycle components, the ones that have been observed, but also the ones that have not been observed, the latent ones, that gives very plausible results about how the water is kind of moving around on the Earth. Maybe specifically here, the root zone soil moisture has been inferred, and it's hypothesized. It's kind of a data assimilation approach, if you want, but very data driven. But the patterns that we see actually do make quite some sense, but of course need to be also further analyzed. One thing that we really like, that I think my last slide here, is that we do really get meaningful inference, and we were at first puzzled a bit by the result. So if we basically plot the soil water deficit here on the x-axis and the evaporative fraction, so how much of the energy is used to evaporate water. If it's dry, then there's no water, and then the evaporative fraction should be low. And that's also what we see here in the majority of the data points. If the soil water depth is higher, the evaporative fraction goes down. But there are still these yellow points. In this case, we didn't color them at the beginning, but now they are yellow, where actually evaporative fraction can be very high, even if the soil water deficit is very strong. So, and the soil is actually very dry. And then what we did basically, we plotted time since precipitation bigger than 0.5 millimeters. And what we see in yellow is basically these little re-wetting events where the overall soil is still dry, but the surface is not dry because we had a little bit of rain. This kind of interception, that interception evaporation that is being seen here. And this is basically modeled by the model, and it must be somewhere in the internal states of the neural network because we didn't have interception in the model. But it learns basically that under certain situations, we can actually have a high evaporative fraction, although we didn't tell the system at all that this could happen. So that it's just one example that gives actually some possibly some insight, but also some confidence in this modeling approach. Yeah, this is my last slide. A very last slide is actually, I just want to give a little bit of advertisement for our Alice program that exactly it revolves around that topic of machine learning for Earth and climate science, many different aspects. I'm leading that together with Gustav Comswals from Valencia. And yeah, contact me. Just we also have a mailing list. So if you want to get in contact, feel free to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Markus, for your talk. I'm going to stop the recording right now, and